first lecturer will be Professor Misia Doms. She studied German literature and language, philosophy and history of medicine, which is quite interesting, at the University of Mainz, where she defended her doctoral thesis in 2007. She later was a research associate at the Saarland University and the University of Mannheim, and finally as a junior professor at the University of Düsseldorf. Since 2018, she is now appointed Professor of German Studies, Multilingualism and Interculturality at the University College of Teacher Education in Lower Austria, and in German that's the Pädagogische Hochschule Niederösterreich. Yeah, and she will talk to us about the Ashes Without Phoenix, the end of the Habsburg Empire, in the works by Alexander Lernet-Holenia and Joseph Roth. And I'm very proud to present her now, and I'm looking forward to your words. Thank you.
Thank you to you. I'm very happy to be linked with you via Zoom. I'm on holiday because of my timetable, which didn't allow me any other time of the year to go on holiday, and won't allow me to be on holiday in August or in September or whatever. So I had to leave on holidays now. However, I'm very happy to be with you. It's for the last days of an empire, namely the Habsburg Empire, and it's a presentation on two literary texts. So you can't expect some accurate historical insights from it, but just the insights of the authors might be interesting, who lived through the end of the Habsburg Empire and the end of the last days of the monarchy. I'll concentrate on Roth's Radetzkymarsch, which contains more information on our topic. There are many parallel thoughts and ideas and images in Lernet-Holenia's text as well. The Habsburg Empire in the novel by Roth can be described as by the metaphor of a circle whose center is everywhere, namely in each place where there are railway stations, barracks, district commissions, or other emblems of the Habsburg monarchy. And one of these emblematic objects also is a portrait of the emperor himself, which can be found in almost any place, even in nightclubs. The perimeter of the circle, in the metaphor I'm going to use for the perimeter of this circle, includes the whole world. This metaphor is not mine, but it's a metaphor of the Christian tradition, where it is used as an image of God, actually. God is seen as a circle whose center is everywhere and whose perimeter comprises everything that exists. Of course, this traditional metaphor, it dates from the antiquity and was handed on to medieval and early modern times, and even very recently it can be found in some theological reflections. This metaphor, of course, is not true with the Habsburg Empire on an objective level. The main difference in the use of the metaphor is not the shift from a religious to the political sphere. This shift, as I'm sure you have seen in other presentations as well, this shift happens quite often. But the main difference is that this point of view is only subjective. It's not an objective perspective, of course, because there is some beyond Habsburg. It's not it's not the country beyond whose borders nothing exists. But for the figures, for the characters present in Roth's novel, the Habsburg monarchy means the whole world. They can't imagine another world. It's repeatedly written that the downfall of the Habsburg Empire means the downfall of the whole world. It means nothing else than an apocalypse. However, there exists beyond even in these texts, and it exists very clearly when the characters reach the border, which is the case in both novels. One being set on the border between the Serbian part of the empire and the Hungarian part of the empire. Whereas in Roth's novel, there's even a border to a foreign country. It's the border between Russia and the Habsburg Empire, where his protagonists, the protagonists of many of his novels, mainly live. For example, Das falsche Gewicht is another novel which is placed on the border between Russia and the Habsburg Empire, or Tarabas, which is placed on the Russian side of the border, and also placed on the Russian side of the border is his most famous novel, namely Hiob. Another border mentioned en passant in Radetzkymarsch is the border, or another country, not directly bordering to Austria. And the country mentioned is France, where Count Koiniki spends his holidays, like me. And of course, so Koiniki knows that there is a beyond. There are things, there are countries beyond the border. Nevertheless, all these characters are going to die when the Habsburg Empire dies. Koiniki, of course, he doesn't really die, he gets mad instead, but the other characters who are closely linked to the Habsburg Empire don't survive the downfall of their world, which means everything, every existing thing to them. Okay. When is the tipping point reached where the downfall of the Habsburg Empire is described in the novel of Roth in Radetzkymarsch? This tipping point, to my mind, is reached when during a summer party, the army attends, or the officers attend in the manor of Count Koiniki, is ended by the news that Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo. It's a very classical ending. There are many endings in the novel. There are many points, many tipping points where you can clearly see this downfall, but this is one of the most important scenes representing this downfall. At this point, the representatives of different nations suddenly start to change their language. They speak their national languages instead of speaking Austrian German, and they become aware of their ethnic difference. And since they are drunken, they start disputes in a very aggressive tone about this event. Finally, and that's where the circle is really mentioned in the text, they end up in a strange circular movement. The drunken musicians set out to play Chopin's funeral march when they realize, but with a drunken mind, that that something has happened to the royal family. But the guests of Count Koiniki don't move according to the melody, but start a strange dance around the center. They start a circular dance, and they are also disguised with some carnival heads and with some other elements of the party, and they are in part they are laughing, and all this happens with accompanied by the melody of Chopin's funeral march. They circulate around this empty center, and it's empty because there is no emperor anymore to fill this middle place. So that's the point where this Habsburg circle comes to an end. When the center is empty, or as soon as the center is empty, the centrifugal forces will be stronger than the centripetal forces. So the Habsburgian circle will not survive when the family is gone. That in Roth's novel, everything is very closely linked to this genealogic center is a fact that many scholars have noticed already. Before studying the centrifugal forces a bit closer, I want to study the centripetal forces in the novels, in both novels, but mainly in Roth's novel, since it's important to get an impression what actually is destroyed when the center becomes empty. There are, in general, several rules on which stabilization of the Habsburg Empire regularly takes place, namely the level of the individuals, the level of the rituals, and the level of regular proceedings, but even architectural levels. On the level of the individuals, we can, for example, find the district commissioner, who is the father of the protagonist. He forms a stabilizing factor by actually representing the emperor himself in his district. The architectural stabilization can be found in elements such as railroads, streets, or routes, and also in bridges. In Lernet-Holenia's text, for example, there are two bridges over the Danube in Belgrade, which of course reminds of Prince Eugen. These bridges are destroyed in the last days of the war, and the description of this destruction process represents the end of stability. Family tradition and rituals become important, for example, when there take place maneuvers or the Corpus Christi parade. In this case, we can, for example, find a description of the whole of the colors of the rainbow, which is present by the uniforms and the dresses of the attending persons. The mingling of colors means stability to the Habsburg Empire, since it means the mingling of plurality. In the text of Lernet-Holenia, there is another color effect of stability, namely the glittering of the Guiden, the Standarte, the Guiden, which is mentioned in many moments where the protagonist feels close to the empire and feels involved in the empire's affairs. Just one example for the stabilization effect of rituals. There is a Sunday ritual, for example, taking place in the house of the district commissioner, namely the father of the protagonist. And in this ritual, eating has a lot of importance, and the the courses eaten during the Sunday meal actually represent the tradition of the Habsburg Empire as a whole. They eat Tafelspitz, and they eat soup, and they eat sweet Knödel. So that's just the representation of Habsburg eating tradition. Aside from clearly stabilizing elements in the novel of Roth and also in the novel of Lernet-Holenia, we can also find ambivalent entities, which on the one hand help to stabilize the Habsburg Empire, but on the other hand also may be able to contribute to its end, or at least stand outside the Habsburg tradition and represent something else, something beyond. One of these elements is rural life. It becomes ambivalent when it forms the shelter for those not really taking part anymore in the Habsburg affairs. For example, when the protagonist with the army and to come back to his roots, which he thinks to be in the Balkanian landscape, in a rural life, which doesn't have much to do with the Habsburg environment anymore. A problem about rurality in the novel is in both novels also is that the rural environment might be seen as something primitive or something pre-civilized even. That's more clear in the novel, or more evident in the novel of Lernet-Holenia than in the novel of Roth, where rural life has a more positive aspect. Another ambivalent force in the empire is religion. On the one hand, religion contributes to the blessings which keep the Habsburg Empire alive. And that can be seen literally or on literal level when you read the description of a maneuver where the representatives of the religions of the Habsburg Empire address the Emperor Franz Joseph and bless him according to their tradition. There are two masses, one held by the Catholic Church, one by the Orthodox Church, and the Jews are also obliged to bless their emperor. And the same can be seen in the almost religious songs, which can be found in the languages of the nations involved in the Habsburg Empire. For example, the Ukrainian farmers know one song by which they actually bless the Habsburg Empire in their language. Nevertheless, there is not just one state religion, like, for example, later on in Austrofascism, but there is a plurality of religions, and there are some allusions to religions which stand outside the set of religions blessing the emperor, religions in accordance with the emperor. For example, Roth shortly mentions the Muslims in his area of origin on the Balkan, and they are described as a kind of strange, outstanding tradition, not so much religion, but tradition, which has nothing to do with these rituals of blessing the monarch. In Lernet-Holenia's text, for example, there are allusions to a pagan past, which can be found in the cellar of the Konak, the royal palace in Belgrade, there are some statues originating from pre-Christian and even pre-Muslim times, from antiquity maybe, and these statues represent a dark force not included in this blessing process. Public officials are also a very ambivalent force, and the army as well. Both are seen in accordance with each other, since they are described as increasingly indifferent, neglective, or even disrespectful with the emperor, whom they speak of as the old man. The stabilizing element in these forces, army and public officials, is that they are lazy. They want to avoid changes. They want that everything stays as it is. So this is the reason why these forces aren't really dangerous to the Habsburg Empire. This, however, is only true with Roth's novel, but not with Lernet-Holenia, where the army gets in a process of dissolution. The main difference here is war. Before war, these forces want everything to stay as it is. After the onset of war, the individuals included in the army realize the negative aspects of war and thus strive to end their involvement in war. So this is the reason for the difference. However, the public officials and even the officers in the army are still in this mood for avoiding changes. Paternal authority also is a stabilizing factor in the novels of Roth and Lernet-Holenia, but paternalism as a force helping to keep the Habsburg monarchy alive is dangerous because there are children having no father, and there are situations where the fathers are absent, which can then be dangerous because no one teaches the children what to do with the Habsburg traditions and the Habsburg values. There is an allusion to this in Lernet-Holenia's novel. And in Roth's novel, there is a level beyond. It's the level of the grandfathers, who are, in the case of the protagonist, as well as in the case of another character, represent a level beyond the Habsburg Empire. The protagonist has a grandfather who is called the hero of Solferino because he saved the emperor's life in the Battle of Solferino. However, this very hero of Solferino isn't really a character who belongs to the Habsburg Empire, since in the late time of his life he becomes kind of a farmer again. He's a gardener in the gardens of Luxembourg, and he becomes more and more rural in his role, and he doesn't really want to have to do anything anymore with the Habsburg Empire for reasons I won't explain now. The father of Max Demand, who is the medical officer in one of the barracks the protagonist attends, has Jewish roots, and his grandfather in his old days becomes an Old Testament patriarch who is a ruler himself. He becomes deaf, and because of this you have to shout to him like you have to shout to God, as the novel says. So both are escapists from the Habsburg system in a way, proceeding to a life before Habsburg in their old days. Now for the clearly and ultimately dissolving factors of the Habsburg Empire. in the novels, it's they can be subsumed in the they can be subsumed as parcelling and alienation or distanciation processes, which form the clearly centrifugal forces. The distanciation can be found on the level of the emperor and his relationship to his subjects. He becomes not deaf, but his mind clearly loses capacities. Memory becomes difficult. Old age shapes him as a person who is mainly related with himself, but not with others. He becomes, during the novel, his portrait changes as well, not only himself, but also his portrait. It becomes more and more alien, cold, and far away. And the eyes, which have seemed friendly in the beginning, become more and more similar to ice, because he really gets, as a character as well as a figure, as a represented man in the portrait, he becomes more and more distanciated from his subjects. On a psychological level, egoism and also the forces of love can be seen as centrifugal forces, because they contribute to the neglection of the Habsburg value system. Karl Joseph, and as well Menis, who is the protagonist of Lernet-Holenia's novel, fall in love with women. In Karl Joseph's case, there are several women who are married as well. And because of their love for women, they neglect their service in the army, and they neglect their representing Habsburg values. A similar centrifugal force is gambling and visiting nightclubs, which becomes more and more important in the novel Radetzkymarsch. Including this process, there's also a very dubious form of mimicry. For example, there's a so-called Nightingale of Maria Hilf. Maria Hilf is a quarter in a place in Vienna. And this Nightingale of Maria Hilf, in fact, comes from Oderburg, which is Bohumien today, and which is located between today's quarter between Poland and the Czech Republic. So this woman claims to come from the center of the Habsburg Empire and to form a bridge to this very center, but in fact she comes from the periphery as well. There are many other forms of mimicry which could be described in Roth's novel, and which takes more and more place, the place of the authentic, the clear, the central elements. And another change in the portrait of the emperor contributes to this feeling of decay, because more and more of his images become covered with fly excrements. Fly excrements representing a multitude, which changes the singularity of the single image, but which represent as well the neglection of the owners of the portraits, who don't care anymore for cleaning these images or keeping them clean. So, and the second force I've mentioned before, which clearly contributes to downfall, is parcelling. The parcelling is best described in the way architecture falls apart. everything falls apart. Nature actually reconquers the parts of the urban area, mainly on the border, and on the border, that's what the novel says, decay can be seen earlier than in the center. So, as for the reasons contributing to this process of parcelling and this process of distanciation, there can be found another very powerful image in the novel, which might explain the reason for the end of the Habsburg Empire better than the neglectful behavior of the individuals belonging to this empire. In his old days, the empire describes that he feels like floating away from his subjects, that he feels like in a process of moving upward, and of becoming more and more distant to his subjects, in a way that he comes closer to the sky. The sky becomes, the heaven beyond becomes more and more important to him. In German, Himmel is sky and heaven in the same way, in the same word. So in the passage where this process of floating away, which can be seen in the mind of the emperor, is described, there is one important sentence, namely that the emperor is the king of Jerusalem. He has a lot of titles, of course, but one of his titles is being the king of Jerusalem. And the combination of these two images, floating away and Jerusalem, reminds the reader of another image which is very important in literature throughout the centuries, which is the image of the descending Jerusalem, the descending New Jerusalem at the end of the apocalyptic process. Now, this, what happens in the end of the Habsburg Empire, is an upside down process compared to this apocalyptic process, because in the last part of the gospel, there's first the apocalyptic destruction of old earth, and from there on, when everything is gone, when nothing has left of the old world, then the new Jerusalem is going to descend on earth and replace what has been destroyed and forms a stable empire forever. Here, in Roth's novel, however, that's just the opposite thing which happens, because first there is the ascending or even ascension of the king of Jerusalem, namely the emperor Franz Joseph. He's floating up to the skies, and he leaves an emptiness, the emptiness of the circle, which allows apocalyptic movement to come into the Habsburg Empire. It allows for the war, and it destroys the Habsburg Empire. And that's a very sad image for a writer who actually grew up with Jewish tradition, because also in Jewish tradition there is the tradition of an apocalyptic Jerusalem, of a pilgrim ship to the mountain of Zion in the end of the days. And what happens here is that there is no such process in the end, but the end is war, dirt, destruction, and the death of the king of Jerusalem, who is also the king of Habsburg, the Habsburg monarchy, or the emperor of the Habsburg monarchy. So that's the point why, that's the reason why I've called this presentation phoenix without ashes, because there are such powerful religious images like the circle metaphor, or the metaphor of Jerusalem, or the metaphor of holiness of the empire, and they are referred to, but totally destroyed and replaced by an emptiness, which is an emptiness even without God being present among his people. This can be seen at the end of Roth's novel and at the end of my presentation, because there's another very powerful image from Christian tradition. The protagonist wants to get some water for his fellows during his war experiences, because everyone in his troop is thirsty, and he takes his helmet off his head and achieves to get them some water, and is shot in this process, and the water is spilled, so there is no water for anyone. Everybody remains thirsty. His deed, which is religiously important, because there are allusions to the living water. God will give to his people, or Jesus will give to his people, to cure their thirst forever. This image is turned into an image of spilling water, leaving more thirst than before. And in a way, it's a cruel God. It's a cruel kind of religion who has foreseen for the subjects of the Habsburg Empire this cruel fate of getting more and more into downfall, into perdition, into destruction, and without any hope for getting out of it. In Lernet, there are some Germanic allusions, or allusions to Germanic tradition and to Germanic end of the world. And as you know, these myths are very, very dark as well, and very hopeless as well. There's something like a fire of the world in the end, and everything will submit to decay. And there's in the first pages of the novel, there's a kind of hope that there's some resurrection from this process, like some new world originating from the old one, or some new Habsburg originating from the old Habsburg, which has gone. But in the last pages, the Gidon, which has given the name to the novel, is burned, and all which remains is ashes. There's no perspective anymore for something new originating out of the old, the destroyed world. So in fact, that nobody knows why fate has condemned people to this dark development, but in the end there's no hope at all that something new will come from it. Yeah, that's what I wanted to explain in my presentation. Thank you for your attention. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Doms. We should definitely read or reread, of course, the oeuvre of Lernet-Holenia and Joseph Roth. I think you're now invited to ask questions, or perhaps add some remarks. Yeah, David Engels.
Yeah, hello, Misia. So thank you very much for this presentation, and it definitely gives me some motivation to retake also my copies of Roth's work. I've just one question. Well, first I have to say that unfortunately the transmission wasn't so great, so it might be possible that perhaps I've lacked one or the other sentence, but or I've missed one or the other sentence. But I wanted to ask: are there also allusions to historical or political ideas or entities, or perhaps even imperial entities outside of the Habsburg Empire in these novels, or are they only dealing with the inside of the Habsburg world? I mean, are there allusions that could be exploited in the sense of our our subject to the Roman Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Tsar's Empire, so to competing imperial entities, or perhaps preceding imperial entities, or is it only the Habsburg Empire which is also the horizon of the political worldview and reality in those novels?
I think it's, to my mind, both novels are really mainly focused on the Habsburg Empire. These novels, of course, Roth has written some novels which are located on the Russian side of the border. But even in these novels, it's the Russian Empire faces decay because of the revolution. It's Tarabas, for example. Tarabas is a text which describes the political evolution, or the political history in the days of 1917, 1918. And in this novel too, it's only decay, it's only downfall, it's only dissolution. There is no transcending of power to this side of the border, or transmission of power to this side of the border. But it's the same process on this and on the other side of the border. In Lernet-Holenia's text, there are only allusions to the past. And there are allusions to the idea of a past dominated by pagan gods, by pagan glory, or something like that. I didn't really like these passages because they seem unclear to me, but it faces the past. As for the future, the only thing which is actually mentioned is some process of decolonization, actually. The text says that the Habsburg Empire has successfully brought civilization to the nations. That's also an idea I don't like. And that the nation can do everything on their own. They don't need such an empire involving them anymore. So parcelling is a process which is not seen in a negative way in Lernet-Holenia's text. In Roth's text, it's negative because there remains virtually nothing. There's nothing that remains. It's just decay. It's nothing new coming out of decay. Because the characters whose perspective is taken are all going to die. So they can't, if there should be something new, they can't see it because they will be dead when the new will come out of the old.
Thank you very much for your answer. Are there other questions in the room or online? So that's not the case. So I once again thank you very much for your interesting speech this morning, Professor Doms, and yeah, have a nice day, and thank you once again.
Thank you once again for inviting me as a guest. And now I'm going to deal with the with the SNCF and its recent problems, which will be difficult as well.
Okay, good luck. Thank you.
Thank you.